So I'm very happy to welcome you all. This is our second seminar for this academic year that is held by the Department of International Relations in our university, the International Laboratory on World Order Studies and the New Regionalism, and the Bulgarian Club. Most of you know, my name is Stefan Stoyanov, and I'm going to be your host today. Today's seminar is going to be a little bit more unusual than our previous one. We are going to talk about Europe again, but our speakers today are actually not from Bulgaria, but they're both wonderful and very, very, very well known. This is, of course, Dr. Marlene Laruelle, research professor at Georgetown University's Eliot School of International Affairs. And I personally think one of the best and most respected Western specialists on Russia. And of course, our own Fyodor Lukyanov, who is the chief editor of Russian Global Affairs, also a scientific director of the Valdai International Discussion Club, and a research professor in our university. I told you in the beginning that this seminar is going to be a little bit more different because our speakers are not Bulgarian, but we are going to imagine that we are not in Zoom, we are somewhere on the shores of the Black Sea, drinking Bulgarian wine and eating Bulgarian tomatoes. This is just a friendly talk, and where everyone represents themselves and not the institutions. The format of our discussion is actually very simple. Every speaker is going to have between 10 and 15 minutes, and after that, we're going to take some questions from our audience. And I presume let's not waste more time. So Fyodor Alexandrovich, I think ladies first, and I'm very happy to give the floor to Professor Laruelle.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Stefan, for the invitation. Nice to see all of you virtually in this difficult time. I'm happy I was able to be here with you and discuss with you. And thank you, Fyodor, for accepting to be here. Let me say a few words about where I think we are and how I see things. And I have to say in the beginning that I'm representing a minority viewpoint. Globally in the West, so don't read what I'm telling you as the Western view because I'm myself in a minority. I see if we want to discuss the relationship between the West and Russia, we have two conflicts at once happening now, right? We have a localized conflict that the West is calling a war, Russia is calling a special military operation, which is happening in Ukraine. And then we have a systemic war between the West and Russia that Russia tends to call a war and that the West call a conflict of a war, depending on people's opinion, and which is happening on many fronts, right? The economic front, the cultural front, the diplomatic front, and so on. And so it's interesting because the relationship between the two conflicts is kind of sometimes shifting, and I'm not sure they are always interrelated. Right, the localized conflict, the one happening in Ukraine, has unclear definition of what would be a victory and a defeat. I think the Russian position has been evolving on what they see as the victory and as a defeat. The West's position has been also evolving. And if you look at Ukrainian survey, the Ukrainian population has also its own evolving vision of what they would consider a victory and a defeat. So it's a very still shifting conflict. The second war, the kind of systemic one, is probably the one we want to discuss here, in which you have Ukraine is only a secondary actor. Of course, Ukraine is a key actor for the first localized war, but for the second one is one actor among many other. I see several things. First, I belong, as I was telling you, to that minority that consider that before February 24, the West and Russia were both responsible for the strategic deadlock. So I don't belong to those who consider that Russia is the only guilty in the game. I consider that the West has its share of responsibilities in what has been happening before February 24 in the region. And as is, of course, it's impacting the way I'm discussing the West because I have a kind of critical perspective on what is happening in the West. If I look at what is happening, my own vision of the way Russia has been dealing with, I see Russia as being weakened by the situation, but not out, right? I think there is a decrease of option on the international scene for Russia, but the country has been able to recalibrating its option and to deal pretty well with the evolving situation. And I think the very active diplomacy toward the global south has been really one of the key strategies of Russia since February 24. Of course, the ability to talk to the West is very limited, right? Not only diplomatically now, but even in terms of speaking to European audience. As you know, we don't have in the West globally, Sputnik or Russia Today are kind of out, so you can still find them online, but they are not spread as they were before. So Russia can still talk to global South audience, but it cannot really talk to Western audience anymore, except on some very limited channel. And there is this kind of global cultural boycott with nuances. Some countries really boycotting, other countries being much softer, but everything Russia related is has become very sensitive. And then you have what is happening to the West. And here, as I told you, I belong to the minority that is pretty critical on the way the West has been analyzing its own situation. What I see that the West has been pretty euphoric at its own unity against Russia. And I see that as a kind of very short-sighted vision. NATO was dying, or not an institution that was not going very well. Before the war, we had tensions, we had Turkey playing its own strategy, we had the French president Emmanuel Macron saying NATO is kind of a dead brain. And then suddenly NATO finds itself kind of rejuvenated by the war. And I belong to those who think that military industrial complex and democracy don't really go together. So I don't belong to those who think that you kind of NATO expansion is a sign of, you know, flourishing democracy. The US was very weakened after the way it mismanaged its withdrawal from Afghanistan. And then it suddenly also got legitimized because it's suddenly leading the fight of democracy against authoritarianism. And I think all that vocabulary is a huge mistake from the West and a huge mistake of interpretation that will have long-term consequences, right? I think the West is largely losing the narrative fight around what is happening in Ukraine because it has been framing that as the war of democracy against authoritarianism. And I think the only way the West could have been talking to the global South would have been saying it's a war about sovereignty and territorial integrity, not a war about democracy, which is not the problem of the global South. I think many of the global South regional powers will be learning from the way the West has been organizing its economic warfare against Russia, and that they will gradually try to take distance from Western financial institutions to be sure that will not be happening to them. What is happening to Russia will not be happening to them. So I think the kind of happiness of the West with itself is a very short-sighted vision, and that the West is not realizing that he will be losing more of the global South, not because the global South is pro-Russian, but because the global South is mostly anti-Western or still has resentment and will be learning about the economic warfare of the West against Russia and will be sure to be protected against that. Just a few more words. I think there will be a growing fatigue in the West of support for Ukraine just for financial reason. It's already slightly there, but it will come with the months. That doesn't mean re-engaging with Russia. Right? I think we should be clear. It's a fatigue about the cost of the war. It doesn't necessarily mean that Western actors want to re-engage with Russia. And of course, when we discuss the West, we have multiple West. I think the gap that we see between Western and Central Europe is still very impressive. You have really a French, German, Italian vision of how to deal with the crisis and a Central European vision. And you have tension inside the European Union about the leading role of Central European actor and especially of Poland, and how that should kind of balance with the more nuanced perspective that you would have from France and Germany. Then you have tension also with the relationship between the US. It cannot be expressed ultra visibly, but it's there. I mean, you have a lot of European policy leaders who realize that the war is costing a lot to Europe, not a lot to the US. I mean, it costs, it's a pretty good business for US economy, while it's really costing a lot for Europe. So Europe will be the one paying the price on the long term. And then in the US, you also have several voices, right? You have from the conservative side, voices that he also shouldn't be interpreted as being pro-Russian. They are not. They are just isolationist, and they consider that US shouldn't be spending too much money on Ukraine. So it's really about the capacity to support financially Ukraine more than it is to re-engage with Russia, which is largely out of question for many actors in the West. I still think that we should re-engage and that the West should be having discussion on Russia, on nuclear issue, on climate change, on all the global issues. I think both Russia and the West are declining. And that's what the West didn't understand, is that very static alliance will not work and that diplomacy will be now very fluid. And I think on that, Russia has been able to deal with this fluidity of world diplomacy much better, especially toward the global South, than what the West has been able to do. Then in terms of re-engaging, I think there are kind of global issues on which the re-engagement should be happening, but the political pressure inside each Western system, the US or the EU one, is very difficult. And so I think it will take years to try to rebuild anything that will be constructive. I will just stop here and I let Fyodor continuing the discussion.
Thank you very much. I'm going to repeat it again because we have some questions about it in the chat section. We have some problem. We are trying to solve it out. If something happens like this again, so please rejoin us and we're going to continue our discussion. And now, Fyodor Alexandrovich.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you for this invitation, or for this opportunity to discuss with Marlene. First of all, I would like to challenge, Stefan, what you said, that none of us, or most here are not Bulgarians, because I believe that we are actually, at least partially, because all of us, or most of us, live or do something for living, which has to do with the Cyrillic alphabet. Without that, we would not be able to exist, which means that Bulgarian part inside ourselves is very important. So it's very natural that we participate in this seminar. As for the topic which we discussed today, I would limit myself to a couple of very short theses, not so much about the political and strategic genesis of this war. Certainly, I agree with Marlene that what is happening is a strategic disaster, strategic catastrophe for all, which will have a profound impact on the future for Russia, for Ukraine, for Europe, for the whole world. We can, of course, maybe not now, but some later, when passions will be lower, discuss very detailed who made what, which side made what to reach this terrible point. But I think we should be aware that in general, the main thing is that this crisis, unfortunately, this particular crisis is product of multiple tensions and contradictions inside the international system, which has been accumulated since a very long time, actually since the end of the Cold War, and especially since 2000s, maybe world financial crisis. And I think this is consensus now almost among everybody, regardless what people think about the current situation, that international community did not address issues which had to be addressed starting from beginning of the century, actually. And unfortunately, this crisis came as a manifestation of this deep collapse, internal collapse of the international system. But I'm afraid that it's just the beginning of a chain of very painful and destructive situations. Hopefully not all of them will be connected to Russia, but who knows. As for relationship between Russia and the West, I also agree that it seems to be beyond repair for a very, very long time. Again, we might argue quite substantially who was more in charge for this situation, but the fact is that the divide, the split between Russia and the West, Russia and Europe in particular, is much deeper than, for example, during the Cold War. Because this time, probably I'm wrong, because I remember just a tiny part of the Cold War, the last part, but still, this time the moral component is much stronger. It's not about ideologies. Yes, indeed, Western politicians, in particular Americans, try to frame this crisis as a conflict between autocracies and democracies, but it's certainly wrong. It's not about that. But when it comes to ethical and moral assessment of how we got there and what is happening, then we see an absolute discrepancy between Russian and Western vision of these events, and I don't see any way how to bridge this discrepancy. And again, I agree with Marlene that those dissidents or those forces in the West who are not in favor of US or European policies vis-a-vis Ukraine, they do that not because of support of Russia, but because of rather mercantilist and egoistic motives, which is absolutely normal, but still. When it comes to Russian side, I think the most important surprise to many people here is that first of all, Russian economy, Russian situation proved to be much more stable to the enormous, unprecedented blow, which was delivered starting from February. And some people even say that we were surprised because those aspects of Russian state, which we believed were weak, like economy, seem to survive and sustain, while those aspects which we believed were strong, like armed forces, they showed a different performance. But anyway, the attempt to send Russia into knockout at once failed. Of course, the accumulative effect of sanctions will come and will grow, no doubt about that. To what extent Russian state will be able to resist? I think it will be able to resist, of course, with significant losses and a lot of problems and chaos inevitably. But still, again, the difference between Russia today and Soviet Union and the latest period of its history is fortunately the market economy, because Soviet Union collapsed primarily because of total rigidity of economic system, while market economy, even in the slightly distorted form as we have now in Russia, is much more flexible and is much more sustainable for survival. What is, from my point of view, quite remarkable that we don't see any significant nuances in how society perceives this situation, the armed conflict in Ukraine. Of course, one thing should be noted that we had a unique process for our history. Basically, the big majority of those who could be vocally and actively against this conflict, they left immediately. And in this regard, President Putin's team achieved a unique result because Bolsheviks had to expel people, had to kill people who were against, to oppress people. In our case, it was not needed because they simply decided to leave this country. And we see this process continuing slightly slower, but still, which means that those who remain, they are, at least they don't feel this situation totally unacceptable, first. Secondly, of course, the level of rejection of Russia, Russians, and even Russian culture, not everywhere, but at some places in the world, in the Western world, created an atmosphere which convinces many people here in this country that we have nowhere to go. Whatever we think about the policy of our government, but this is our government, right or wrong. And what is happening there, it's something completely else. We are not welcome there. And those who go abroad, we see how polarized is the atmosphere between those who left and those who stayed. And basically, it's even worse than between Russia and the West, because those who are actively against this war and against this situation in diaspora, in the new diaspora, they are sometimes absolutely morally radical. And of course, here inside Russia, the perception of what those people are saying is not very nice and very kind. I think that the depth of split is partially produced by the previous period, I mean the period after 1991, because at that point, between 91 and basically mid last century, probably last decade, it was an attempt, unsuccessful, but at some periods very passionate and very strong attempt by Russia under President Yeltsin and then under President Putin to become part, to find a place inside the Western system. And for the first time ever, because the relationship between Russia and the West, Russia and Europe, Russia and the West has been very volatile and tricky for centuries. We know that. But for the first time after the end of the Cold War, after collapse of the Soviet Union, after the so-called proclaimed end of history, the West stopped to be a cultural phenomenon. It became an institution, basically, system of institutions. And those who wanted to join, they had to accommodate to the rules, norms, and principles of those institutions. As, for example, countries in Eastern Europe or former Soviet republics, which aspired to become members of the European Union or NATO. This institutionalized West was, again, a gravitation point for Russia, especially immediately after collapse of the Soviet Union, because the idea of right side of history was at that time shared by many people here as well. But it was to go to the right side of history did mean to accept all those normative, all this normative environment which the West created and developed. And Russia tried to do it in a bumpy way, but still. And it failed. But the period when Russia really made efforts, and I would repeat, the biggest efforts were made by Putin, not by Yeltsin, not by anybody else, not by Kozyrev, but by Putin at the beginning of his presidency between approximately 2000 and 2005, to find a way how to become part of the system, which was not created by Russia, but Russia was ready, Russian government was ready to accept some kind of subordination, but on special conditions, of course, not as Albania or Lithuania and so on. It failed, but this attempt was so strong that, and the pendulum went that far at the side to become part of the West, that then we had the pendulum went at the opposite direction. And now, unfortunately, we have, to some extent, results of what Gorbachev started 35 years ago, actually, when he proclaimed this common European house. So the common European house collapses now indefinitely. And Russia, which was extremely enthusiastic at the beginning to become part of this house, to become inhabitant of this house, or rather a co-architect of this house, now feels totally disappointed in this idea, betrayed and so on. So to conclude, I think I agree with Marlene again, that I think for the foreseeable future, the only thing we can expect from relationship between Russia and the West is some kind of pragmatic, selective interaction on most important issues. It's not that easy to identify them, but certainly they will be identified. And that's it. To try to find the silver lining in this cloud, I would say that to some extent it's important and necessary for Russia to have this experience, not at that price, of course, but in general, a Russian European centrism and Western centrism, which we developed throughout centuries, since 80s, 70s, 80th century, is on the one hand counterproductive, because we go in circles, as we see. And secondly, in today's world, when the West is still very important and very big, very powerful, but not a dominance anymore, and most likely the balance of influences will change further, Russia should learn to get rid of its Western centrism. And by the way, if we will be successful, which was not the case before, never, but if it will be successful, if Russia would be able to develop some kind of higher level of indifference towards the West, I'm sure that relationship will be better, because now part of problem is a lot of passions which lead us to disappointments and disillusion.
Well, we have our first question. If you have any questions, by the way, you can write them in the chat section. You can raise your hand and I'm going to give you the opportunity. And we're going to start with Paul Krupkin.
Yes. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. In principle, I have one question for Ms. Laruelle and one question for Mr. Lukyanov. Question for Ms. Laruelle. Not far ago, Polish Premier Minister told that his politics of which is based on anti-Racism is becomes very popular on the West. So now anti-Racism or extreme Russophobia becomes very popular in Western world. Remembering 30 years ago, beginning of 90s, we can see that there was loaf and flour, at least between Russian state and at least West Europe. What is your vision? What is main driver that transfers this loaf into current hating? Second question to Mr. Lukyanov. Not far ago, you organized very good discussion with participation of Mr. Stefanchuk and Mr. Mezhuev, where there was positioning of Russia in what coming freeze time with Western world. There was two positions. First, that Russia should live without West, and second position, which was presented by Mr. Stefanchuk. And second position was that current situation is just repeating Peter the Great situation, when Russia violently opens the door to the Western world to imposing or establishing itself somewhere there. My question, because in principle, what is your opinion? Do our bosses, top guys, have enough potential to build something autonomous, or in principle we just will frame to repeat way of Peter the Great, way of Alexander the First, way of Stalin, to come back to Europe? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Professor Lukyanov or Professor Norwell, who's going to be first?
Maybe Marlene first question.
I can answer the question. Thank you. I think this anti-racism is still very, I mean, if you identify it as really a refusal of everything Russian, it's mostly limited to Central European countries for obvious reason. In Western Europe, I would say that you had some very strong feelings at the beginning of the war. Now it's kind of, it has slowed down. I think in the US also, it can be there in the policy circles, those who are really following closely. But for the average citizen, Russia is still very far, and there is not this kind of huge, you know, anti-Russia. There is mostly a negative feeling, but the refusal of everything Russian is really very much very strong in Central Europe and not really in Western Europe. I think also we should be realistic in that, except for Central European audiences for whom everything related to the conflict is very kind of sensitive, the Western audiences, for them, the conflict is pretty far. So if you have media attention, at a certain point, you can have a wave of kind of pretty negative reaction toward Russia. But if the media are less covering the conflict itself, then the public audience kind of take distance and has a pretty global negative overview of Russia also, but not something very passionate that would be visible, you know, in everyday life and so on. We still have cultural events that are Russia related in Western Europe. It was difficult in March, April. Now it seems to be back. So I think it's going by wave. But the big anti-Russism like is really coming from Central Europe.
Professor Lukyanov?
Yes, I remember, of course, this discussion between Safranchuk and Mezhuev. Mezhuev's point, by the way, was he described what is happening as another attempt to repeat the way of whoever to get back to Europe, to prove by force that Russia should belong to Europe. Mezhuev himself is strictly against this approach. He is just arguing that Russia should get rid of this passion, and he promotes the civilizational indifference as the way to put it in a more practical terms to deal with our own problems and to try to be not to be part of any struggles around. As for Ivan Safranchuk, he argued that we should find ways how to bypass United States and the West where it is possible, and not confront them. So, and that requires theoretically very skillful diplomacy and a lot of other means. And again, theoretically, it might be more possible now than before, due to what Marlene just said in her introduction, that the non-West, the global South, is very much tired of the West, and actually is ready not to attack West, not to struggle against the West, but to find ways to escape the Western hegemony. So as for my personal, my own view, I don't see any signs yet of emerging, of something emerging here in our country, which would create an autonomous self-identification. We still are inside the same framework, in particular with the West. But I believe that the objective situation which we described, that the relationship with the West has been distracted, has been broken significantly, that will probably push Russia towards a less Western centric, Western thinking position, which again, I think is positive, because in the world where Asia is the main space, and that will only strengthen in decades to come, to be painfully, to be so much occupied by the West, focused on the West, it's simply wrong. So I hope that step by step it will happen, not because our leadership, as you asked, has any idea, but because the situation will push us towards that.
Thank you. Two more questions. The first one is going to be from Timofey Victorov.
Yeah, thank you very much. Good. I have a question for Mr. Lukyanov. So my question is, what do you think about potential of Russia to build a sustainable economy, especially in technological sector under such heavy sanctions? And also, what are the potential of like international cooperation in technological sectors, like with China or maybe with India, considering the fact that you say would impose heavy sanctions if they like try to cooperate with us in technological sector. So what is the way?
Thank you. I would also love to hear Professor Laroel's opinion on this question as well.
If I would have question or would have answered to a question, I would immediately go to our government and ask for a very established position there. Unfortunately, I don't know. I think that, of course, that will be the biggest challenge. The technological development will be the biggest challenge for Russia in years, maybe decades to come. And of course, the main aim and effectiveness of sanctions imposed are exactly there, to slow down Russian development, to cut Russia from any sources of modern and advanced technologies. And yes, indeed, to watch closely who is trying to cooperate with Russia in this field. As for the latter part, I think that despite this very harsh compliance, which Americans will impose on everybody, that will go in one way or another way. So people will find legal, illegal, gray methods how to find what they need. Difficult, very difficult, but still. As for the general picture, whether Russia will be able to compete on the highest level, I doubt that. So we certainly will not be able to reach out to the highest league, to the Premier League in technology. But the question is it that necessary, or probably it's enough to find substitutes for the most important technological solutions, maybe not the most advanced solutions, but at least the sufficient, the modestly okay solutions. And of course, in the foreseeable future, we will deal with very practical issues like aviation, for example, which might become one of the biggest problems in a very short period of time. Again, I believe in market economy, which still exists in Russia, and I believe in creativity of Russian people. But of course, to think that Russia will be able to come to this group of the most developed technologically most developed countries, I don't think it's possible.
We also have a question for Professor Norwell in the chat section. Is the anti-West position enough to explain why the Russian narratives find resonance in the non-West? And I will also widen a little bit this question. Is anti-Americanism the not the most, but the main instrument in Russia's foreign policy toolbox?
Yeah. I think the global south, sorry, my voice is breaking, I was thinking. In the Ukraine conflict, the global south is maybe seeing like Ukraine fighting for its own independence against a colonial Russia. So in that case, they see the colonial aspect, but they also see, you know, NATO has been pushing too much against Russia. So NATO is also guilty, and NATO doesn't have a good, you know, reputation in many countries, especially in the Middle East. And I think the vision is that, okay, maybe Russia is a colonial power, but it's a colonial power for its neighborhood, while the US and Europe having been global colonial power. And so I think that both in Latin America and in sub-Saharan Africa, so Latin America toward the US, sub-Saharan Africa toward Europe, you have a very strong feeling that you have a neo-colonialism coming from the West that is more dangerous than the Russia one. So as I said, it's not about being pro-Russian. It's just about saying like, it's the problem of the global North, that war. We won't participate in it. We won't pay the cost of a war that is happening between colonial powers. And we will just take distance and have a transactional, fluid foreign policy that is just serving our own interests without having to follow the normative order coming from the West.
Thank you very much. One more question from Andrei Krikovic.
Okay, thank you. Nice to see you, Marlene, after a long time. And Fyodor, thank you guys for organizing this. So my question would be along the lines of Marlene's comments. I think we've seen a lot in the Russian narrative. I just read Dmitry Trenin's lecture. I couldn't attend it. I was traveling. I was coming from the global south, so I have some insights about how they feel about Russia. But he made an explicit argument that Russia's support in the global south as a defender of sovereignty, non-interference, was a great asset. Fyodor, I also read an article by you, commentary. I can't remember if it was in Россия в глобальной политике or if it was in Российская газета, where you also made this argument. I've talked to some other of our colleagues that are making this argument that actually the world is with Russia, but how credible a partner is Russia when it is actually engaging in imperialist activities, violating sovereignty, and the most extreme kind of forms of violence against civilians and infrastructure and these kinds of things? It seems like that delegitimizes Russia as a carrier of this kind of new sovereign order that's, let's say, true to the UN Charter and sovereignty and all of those other things. So I'd like maybe, I think Marlene gave her take on it, but Fyodor, if you can give your take. And then you also said, well, you know, Russia has a lot to offer, but I would question, what does a declining Russia besides oil have to offer to the rest of the world, especially since, you know, the military component, which would in the past seem like it would help you stand up to the United States, or if you're in India, maybe to China, doesn't seem to hold as much weight as it did before. So those would be my questions to both of you.
Thank you. Professor Lukyanov, are you going to start?
Yeah, about the Global South, I never said or wrote that the Global South is with us. I wrote exactly what we discussed earlier, that the Global South is not with the West in this conflict. I don't think that we have a lot of support of what is happening in Ukraine, and I always try to argue to those who here in Russia try to insist that we need that support. I don't believe actually we need, because Russia is trying to implement its own political and strategic agenda. We might discuss whether it's legitimate or not, whether it's right or not, but it is the case. And this is an agenda which is only ours. Just ours. So to expect anybody else, be it in the South, in the West, or in the East, to support it, it would be strange. But what we see is the pretty clear rejection of a Western claim and American claim in the non-Western world, rejection to join the coalition against Russia. Again, not because they believe Russia is okay or Russia is good, but they believe that the West is not in the position to dictate them what to do. And I think this is strengthening, this is growing.
Yeah.
Yeah, please.
Yeah, if I can add on that, and I think I agree with Fyodor, and I think, Andrei, what Russia has to offer, it's not about oil or whatever. It has to offer itself. So just Russia is too big to fail. No one in the Global South has interest for Russia to be totally defeated and humiliated and because it's too much a victory for the West. So just by its own existence, and just because it's fighting the West, Russia is legitimate. Just to be supported, not because people are pro-Russian or want oil and gas, but just because it cannot afford to fail. Otherwise, the world system would be too much pro-Western, So I think that's the vision. I would also slightly, in some countries of the Global South, think that, some countries have been facing violence a lot. So the images they see from Ukraine, I'm not saying they are not sensitive to them, but it's not as shocking for some public opinion as it can be. And I think if you look in the Middle East, for example, at the beginning of the war, there was really strong reaction about, okay, what has been happening in the Middle East? We also had awful images, right, of violence, but we are more sensitive because it's happening in Ukraine, it's on European territory, it's happening to people that look like us. So from the Middle East perspective, there was a lot of discussion about, look how it's easier to receive Ukrainian refugees than it was to receive Middle Eastern. So kind of relaunching the racism and xenophobia argument, right? So I think that also has to be taken into consideration. But I think for the big country like China, India, it's just that Russia cannot fail. No one can afford to have Russia losing entirely. It can be weakened, but it cannot lose.
We had one question in the chat section. It is not that much about foreign policy, but I think it's still interesting to hear your opinions on it. How does the international environment influence societies in Russia, in Europe, even at some point in the United States? So again, it would be just interesting to compare your views, because Fedor is in Russia, as we know, Dr. Norwell is in the United States. How those societies see the situation now?
As far as the Russian society is concerned, I just mentioned that in my initial remark. I think that it works both ways. One way is to split, and not very big but significant part of society decided to disassociate itself from Russia, and to go somewhere else. That was a clear impact of not only Russian action, but also Western and international perception of what Russia is doing. On the other hand, there is a consolidating effect that people here, not all maybe, but many people here feel attacked by the consolidated Western position against Russia, against everything Russian. And rightly or wrongly, but it makes people think that whatever we feel about this country, about this government, but this is our country and our government, and we should try to do something here rather than to go somewhere else where we by default are others, are aliens. And that's a paradoxical impact, but we will see how it will evolve, because now I think it's too early to judge the final outcome.
Yeah, on my side, I think the American society is very far away from foreign policy issues globally, right? It's a society that is very much in a kind of autistic situation toward the rest of the world. So for average American, everything is far away. I mean, they see inflation, they see prices, but it's still very far away as a conflict. And so it doesn't have a large impact on the way, you know, domestic issues are discussed. It's impact the elites, of course, but the average American citizen is far away. I think in Europe, it's very much different. I think, and especially this winter, because we are in Europe kind of living through the crisis, especially the energy one and the inflation one. I think it will have a long-term impact, not so much on how people are looking at Russia or Ukraine, but how people believe in their own government ability to, you know, to protect them. I think after 2 years of pandemics and now the winter crisis, I think a lot of European societies are kind of rethinking, you know, the way you trust the government, the way you trust yourself, your own families, which kind of, you know, community solidarity you want to have, how you have to envision the future, how, you know, your financial life is impacted and so on. So I think there is a global pessimism coming from European societies, and it's a kind of waking up call that I think is good to have for European society, to realize that they were living in a very optimistic and naive world, and now they are kind of back on Earth, and it looks more gloomy than it was, but it's a good wake-up call, and it will have political influence and impact on the forthcoming election, I think, for a pretty long time.
We have one more question from Timofey Victorov. Please be quick.
Yeah, also I have one more question for both Marlene and Ms. Lukyanov. So what is the future of Ukraine? I mean, what will happen to state from your point of view?
Well, I can begin. It's a difficult question. It's unclear. I think everybody has been impressed by the capacity of the Ukrainian state and the Ukrainian society to resist and to function in their kind of everyday state function, you know, like dealing with the infrastructure and all that, and the kind of the horizontal solidarity that has been quite impressive on the way it has been functioning. That doesn't tell a lot about how, you know, post-war or reconstruction will happen, and probably the kind of the unity, the national unity that you see now in Ukraine will also at some point in time will kind of weaken. You will see older division or new division re-emerging. You will have doubt. I think the kind of support for Zelensky could also, that is almost total now because it's the war condition, could also weaken. So it will really depend on how things are going on the field, the military field for them, and also how European and American support will continue or slowly kind of slow down. That will impact any kind of projection of but for sure it's a turning point in Ukraine history. I mean, there will be, of course, no go back. It's a new Ukraine that will be emerging, but it will be a Ukraine with a lot of issues, probably. Just for the moment, these issues are not put on the table because people are feeling in a kind of existential fight.
No, I think that however the military phase will end and how the configuration of Ukraine will look like at the end, it will be highly nationalistic, probably not very much democratic, pretty demanding towards all neighbors, in particular towards Europe, state, very committed to the idea of revenge towards Russia. Again, however this phase will end, but certainly Ukraine will not be fully satisfied, as Russia will not be fully satisfied. So most likely we will have an ideal precondition for the next conflict in the foreseeable future. But Ukraine, from the Russian point of view, unfortunately, as it looks now, Ukraine will double or triple or I don't know, quadruple all those characteristics which President Putin described in his article in year 2021 as a project anti-Russia. That will be a real anti-Russia project like Pakistan, India, but much worse actually.
Thank you. And to end our discussion, I would also like to ask you a question. Well, I believe most of you have watched House of the Dragon, and after it ended, a lot of people, including myself, well, we rewatched Game of Thrones again. And actually the end got me thinking, because most of the characters or fractions, they already had their big victories. They could stop somewhere in the middle and just lived happily ever after. But they actually decided to continue the war between themselves until everything was pretty much destroyed. My question is not going to be about Game of Thrones, but it's going to be about human nature. So which is closer to us as people, as Europeans or Russians, to fight to the very end, no matter the cost, because we know that if you're Western, you're on the right side of history, and if you're Russian, the truth is on your side. Or our instincts for self-preservation, they will prevail in the end, and someone is going to say enough is enough. Where is the ending point? And just short answers.
I mean, I think if you talk about population level, the self-preservation is dominating. I mean, I don't think people want a nuclear war in the name of what is happening now. Then after you have the question of the elites, what the elites want, what they can do, how they can lose control of the escalation. But I think the population on both sides, both the Russian population and the European population, mostly would like to be able to, you know, focus on what matters in their private life. Not that it's not important to have, you know, prestige, great power, or to think they are on the right side of history, but I think it's secondary when they have to make the final choice, but they are not the one deciding, right? It's decided at another level where elites may suddenly decide that it's worse, that dying is worse, some ideas, right? But I don't think many people on the ground are so much ready. They are ready to die for existential issues, but if they don't feel it's an existential fight so far, then I think they would prefer the self-preservation aspect.
Professor Lukianov, before your answer, I want to give the word to Ian Ferguson. I presume he has a question as well. Just keep it short, please.
Sure, thank you very much. A question to both the speakers, just about the parting of the ways between Russia and the West. You've both spoken about how there are certain, there was common ground, perhaps in the early 2000s, which is now all but disappeared. And I just wonder what you think that might mean for the prospects of a peace within the UN framework for Ukraine, which would have conventionally followed perhaps what is known as a liberal peace blueprint. Whether you think there is a kind of the kind of parting of the ways in terms of values and norms and worldviews between Russia and the West, what does that actually mean for the kind of peace we might expect within the UN system for Ukraine? Do we have to kind of look for new ideas beyond a liberal peace blueprint?
Professor Lukianov, can we start with you?
The first question about options, I'm afraid that at this point, both leaderships perceive this fight as an existential battle for slightly different reasons, but it is the case, which means that it cannot, any compromise cannot be imagined. This is classical zero sum. And what should happen to bring Zelensky and Putin, or Ukrainian leadership and Russian leadership, to the idea of negotiated solution? So far, I don't see something like this, especially on the Ukrainian side, because they feel as if they really can achieve a final victory and to regain the whole territory. Slightly better on the Russian side, but still I don't see, not yet at least. And that brings me to the next question by Ian, because I think that the liberal peace in the liberal framework at this point is absolutely unavailable. What could be the best outcome? Maybe not very much sustainable, but the best out of what we can imagine. This is what has been discussed in the United States as well, the so-called Korean option, to freeze, to fix the dividing line and to freeze the conflict without any solution, actually, without any legal framework. It's very difficult to imagine that this kind of solution might work with such a long line. But still, at least it will not demand any kind of setup of conditions and which should be negotiated, because I don't believe in any kind of negotiations between Russia and Ukraine, not at all. Whether it's available or not, we will see. Probably, as in Korea, we can remember that this line, actually, this parallel, was more or less stabilized pretty early, but 2 more years they tried to change situation, then they failed, and at the end it was frozen. Probably it will be like this here.
If I can add on that, I think, yeah, any liberal peace scenario wouldn't work. I'm even not sure the kind of Korean scenario would work, because I don't think Ukrainians would accept it. I think that even if you would imagine the Ukrainian leadership having to accept that, then on the ground, you would have a kind of popular guerrilla that would continue and that would kind of fragment the Ukrainian society. So I don't think that would be very easy to sustain. I think so far, there is nothing in view in the forthcoming months until probably the spring, and depending how the spring is happening. But Ukraine is also, I mean, the Ukrainian leadership is also not necessarily in control of what the population wants, right? They may decide or be forced to negotiate, but the population, at least part of it, will continue to fight. And so you would have a kind of guerrilla atmosphere on both sides of this kind of Korean line that I think would be very difficult to control and wouldn't make Russia happy. So I don't know.
And on this note, we can finish our seminar. It was a great pleasure to host you, and I think it was an interesting meeting. I'm terribly sorry about our technical issues. To be honest, we didn't expect them. We expected a cyber attempt because we already had one, but not technical issues. And I also want especially to thank to our speakers, our marvelous speakers, I should add, for first accepting our invitation and finding time for us. We really appreciate it. And for all, stay tuned for our new events at the department. And also I remind you that all opinions that you have heard belong to those who said them and not the club, faculty, or the university. Thank you once again for participating. Thank you for your questions. There is going to be a recording. Yes, you should check the website of our laboratory. I think in several days this is going to be there already. And hope to see you soon and stay safe. Thank you very much once again.
Thank you all. It was good to see you.